Well, this is very much the low-tech part of the day, but hopefully high inspiration. The title, as you could tell, make social entrepreneurship, can social entrepreneurship make America great again, is a pretty direct allusion to the divided society that America now has, and the sense that the last election maybe went the way it did in part because there are some serious breakages in the American society that need to be fixed. And the difference between a social entrepreneur and a regular entrepreneur is not, as some people think, that regular entrepreneurs are trying to make a profit and social entrepreneurs are non-profit. In fact, many social entrepreneurs today are for-profit people. The difference is that a social entrepreneur, their intention is to solve a major social problem through entrepreneurial innovation. And what we want to talk about in this session is how America, actually there are some interesting examples of how social entrepreneurs are starting to work in parts of America that maybe, probably voted Trump and are actually maybe solving some of the problems that encouraged people to vote for Trump in the first place. And to talk about that is Constanza, and she works for Ashoka. Ashoka is one of the organizations that I wrote about in Philanthrocapitalism that has been dedicated for 20 or 30 years to building up social entrepreneurs from around the world to help them be much more effective and operate at a much larger scale than they would have done. They're kind of like the equivalent of the venture capital industry and some of the ecosystem around venture capital for traditional startups. And I wanted to start really with, you took over running America for Ashoka a couple of years ago, and in a sense you saw part of the echo chamber or the divided nation problem firsthand in what Ashoka had actually already been doing in America, and then you set about trying to change that. Can you just talk about what the problem was internally at Ashoka in a sense?
Yeah, sure. And it comes actually back to what we just saw before, and that is that the other, who you don't know, is not just, thousands of miles away in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but probably also a couple of 100 miles away somewhere in West Virginia or in Arkansas or in Alabama, who you don't understand. And where you wonder why on earth did they vote the way they did, or what is actually happening in this country here. And so I'm European. I moved to the US 2 years ago together with a colleague who had been in Africa for a long time working on rural innovations. And so we came here and looked at the data. We're looking for rural fellows and discovered there aren't that many. When I say fellows, I mean social entrepreneurs. There weren't that many. And
in your network?
In our own network, and even less so in other networks. And so we discovered that most of the nationally celebrated social entrepreneurs live and work in 4 cities. And I guess you can guess which cities that are. It's Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., and the Bay Area. And so we were that was ahead of, the election, a year before that, in fact, and we were thinking, are we in a bubble? Like, are we just looking at, invention, or tend to look more at invention that come from people who are like us, and what is actually happening out there in Tennessee and in Wisconsin and in all the other states. And so we decided to go out and learn more about this country and what is happening in it through a lens of solutions, which has been a very, very rewarding journey.
So tell us a bit about some of the, because you've now found, 6 or 7 new social entrepreneurs that you are working very closely with in your network, who are from parts of the country where you weren't operating at all before. Can you tell us a bit about 2 or 3 of them and what they're doing?
Sure. I mean, I must also say, so we already had probably 50, 60 working in those areas, but way over 170 in those cities. So the first thing that we found is when you go, for example, into the South, many people will, for example, not talk about a business plan, but they will say it's the plan God has for me. Or they will not talk about their talents, but about God's gifts. So they're reference to other, belief systems and other. They'd also use different, languages can be different, but this is not to, divert attention from the fact that these are hardcore change agents. The second thing we found is that, it can be kind of raw out there. Childhood hunger, literacy. These are all very pressing problems in some of the rural areas, but even in like Memphis, Tennessee, for example. And then what has been most interesting for me and fascinating for me is that you're really finding solutions that you think are, you would never find in, let's say, Boston or New York. And I can give you an example about gun violence, which is a topic I find, or gun control, which is a topic I find particularly exotic from a European perspective. You don't really understand why people would be wanting to be running around with their weapons. But, it's something, okay, I sort of understand it might be different here, but I never really quite understood it. And then we found this social entrepreneur. She comes from Arkansas. She is this tiny woman with long hair, and she can probably assemble a semi-automatic weapon blindfolded. I don't know whether she really can, but I trust her she can, because she grew up with weapons. She hunted as a kid. She comes from a farm, and it was just normal for her to live that way. And later on, she moved to Miami, became a police reporter for the Miami Herald, and her view on weapons and gun control changed. But as a result, she almost fell out with her family. So whenever she would travel back home, there would be this huge clash in terms of, yes, Second Amendment, no Second Amendment, yes, I may have my gun wherever I want to carry it, or no. And they almost fell apart. Until one day she came back and said, look, let's have a beer, and let's today just focus on the things that we actually agree on. And so they sat down and they had a conversation, and they figured out that they were agreeing on quite a bit. Actually on almost 80%. But what had happened is that this, the sort of poison, the polarized conversation had always obscured everything else. And so that experience sort of, instigated cases.
What were they agreeing on, for example?
They would be agreeing on, for example, that there shouldn't be you should curb the use of illegal weapons, because local crimes in communities are most often committed with the use of illegal weapons. Nobody wants that, not the police, not the gun industry, not the hardcore Republicans, and not the liberals. So that is something that you can easily create coalitions around, which is, by the way, also something she's doing. So she is creating coalitions between all the different diverse groups around things that they can agree on if they don't focus on the 20%. And around that, she builds coalitions from Arkansas to New Hampshire in order to sort of make communities safer.
And what's her organization called? What's her name?
It's Arms with Ethics, and Casey Woods is her name.
And then you've also found an example of work on immigration to solve some of the problems around that.
Yeah. David Lubell, for example, Welcoming America, works out of Atlanta, and he is bringing immigrant communities and, let's call it, native communities together in a mediated process that involves religious leaders, spiritual leaders, union leaders, and basically mediates a process by which both sides find out that they actually have a lot in common. They want jobs and prosperity. And they also figure out that together they can achieve more of it than against each other. So it's, again, a place of finding the common ground.
And they've turned a place like Nashville, which had one of the lowest immigration populations, the one that's been quite a welcoming population.
Exactly. So he's flipping community after community.
So, I mean, what does this tell us about, those in the audience here, for example, that may be giving to support social entrepreneurs, or maybe investing in social entrepreneurs, or may want to figure out how do they go into Trump country and actually start to support people who are, trying to find an alternative way than the shouting and the violent approaches that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you should do it through us because we are building this infrastructure. But no, seriously, I think it is a moment in time where, it's funny. because we think we are so connected and we are so alike and we understand everyone because we are on Facebook and Twitter together all the time, but we are still so much apart. I think it is time to really find those who look at the common ground that we all have and get people to work together on solutions across differences, and that will drive I think the country back together, and and picks people up from where they are.
And what is this infrastructure that you're building for them?
Well, it's first of all the network in order to find them, and then secondly a support structure that runs from stipends to sort of pro bono support, but also sort of network of peers and connections, so that someone who lives on the coast can exchange ideas and import and exports with someone who lives in the heart of the country. And it's interesting to see, when we're getting together in, let's say, convenings or houses, and then, people can say, praise the Lord, or people can, say something more, down to earth, and we all get on.
And, I mean, one of the things that strikes me as so interesting about this story is that, Ashoka I've always been very impressed by in other countries, like India or whatever, where they have come in and just focused on what are the problems, who's trying to solve them. And yet America, where it was founded, this sort of inherent, implicit bias is essentially towards what we're familiar with, has meant that you haven't reached out into those other areas. But actually when you do, there do seem to be tremendous opportunities. I guess I wanted to ask, what do you see as what's the biggest challenge facing your social entrepreneurs in those states where you haven't been active before, or so active before, in terms of really scaling up what they're doing?
Yeah, let me first answer in terms of why I think we haven't really been so active in that geography earlier, is that you tend to talk to people who are similar to you. And so once you have a bias towards those who are familiar with entrepreneurship and venture capital and networks and technology, so you talk to them and they talk to others who are in that bubble, and so it reinforces the bias. And then to come to your question, what do these guys out there? I mean, I'm exaggerating the difference, but what do social entrepreneurs outside of those four areas need? I mean, we are really seeing that this definition of giving an identity and a profession adds a lot of value, because it changes the view of who you are and what you can achieve in the world. Which gets
so you
reinforced.
name them as social entrepreneurs, and that makes a difference.
Yes, exactly. It gives a feeling of identity, and you see you're not alone. There are others out there, and you actually belong to that community. Because what we are seeing in the middle of the country is that oftentimes, support is more local and more, and there's not the natural assumption, perhaps, that you can go national, or that you are solving issues for the entire country, but you're all solving an issue for Nashville, let's say. Which is not true. Very often the blueprint of what can be relevant there, it has a relevance for the rest.
Great. So you're optimistic about what you're seeing, and I think if you go to ashoka.org, you can find out more about this as well. So, Constanza, thanks very much.
Thank you,
Great,
Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you.